I don't know why he walked out that door. That's what Katie Proudfoot said about her missing son, Sebastian Rogers. But here's the problem. There were no footprints, no scent trail, no missing shoes. And the door? It was found locked. So how could she know he walked out, when the evidence says he never did? In the first 6 days after Sebastian disappeared, Katie slipped at least 3 times, describing her son in the past tense, adjusting her timeline to match her husband's version, and uttering a sentence she could not possibly know to be true. Meanwhile, Chris Proudfoot, her husband, controlled every interview, corrected her answers, and built a narrative so tight, so precise, it started to feel scripted. One person constructs the story, the other covers for it, and somewhere in between, a 5-year-old boy with autism vanished without a trace. Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. This is the disappearance of Sebastian Rogers, and nothing about it adds up. Sebastian Wayne Drake Rogers was just 15 years old when he disappeared from his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, a quiet town about 20 miles northeast of Nashville, nestled in Sumner County. It's the kind of place where neighbors know each other, where Friday night football matters, and where a missing child doesn't just shake a family, it shakes an entire community. Sebastian wasn't like most teenagers. He was autistic, which meant the world worked a little differently for him. Communication didn't always come easy. Social cues that most kids pick up instinctively, for Sebastian, they required effort, patience, and understanding. He wasn't the type to strike up conversations with strangers or navigate unfamiliar situations on his own. In fact, those who knew him said he thrived on routine. Predictability was his comfort zone. He had his quirks, his interests, his own way of seeing things. Like a lot of kids on the spectrum, Sebastian found solace in specific hobbies. He loved technology, spent time on his devices, and had a fascination with maps and geography. He wasn't the kind of kid who'd just wander off into the night without a plan, without a reason, without telling someone. That's not how his mind worked. At home, Sebastian lived with his mother, Katie Proudfoot, and his stepfather, Chris Proudfoot. The family dynamic was complicated. Katie had full custody of Sebastian, but Chris, who had been in the picture for a few years, played a significant role in the household. By all public accounts, they presented themselves as a united front, a blended family trying to make it work in small-town Tennessee. But beneath the surface, there were cracks. There had been CPS involvement in the past, allegations unverified, but documented of harsh discipline, reports that Chris had used a belt on Sebastian, whispers from prior relationships about escalating conflicts involving children. None of it was ever proven in court, but it lingered in the background like a shadow no one wanted to talk about. Sebastian's daily life was simple. He attended school, came home, spent time in his room, played on his devices, ate dinner with the family. He wasn't rebellious. He wasn't running with a bad crowd. He didn't have a history of sneaking out, getting into trouble, or defying authority. In fact, his autism made him more dependent on structure, not less. The idea that he would suddenly, in the middle of the night, decide to leave his home alone, in the dark, without shoes, without a plan, goes against everything we know about how his brain worked. And yet, that's exactly what his family would later claim happened. Sebastian was also vulnerable in ways that most teenagers aren't. His communication challenges meant that if something was wrong, if he was scared, hurt, or in danger, he might not have been able to articulate it clearly. He might not have known how to ask for help. And in a household where discipline was reportedly strict, where a stepfather held significant authority, and where a mother seemed emotionally dependent on her husband's narrative, that vulnerability becomes even more concerning. The community loved Sebastian. When he went missing, hundreds of volunteers flooded the area. Search parties combed through woods, fields, and neighborhoods. Flyers went up on every corner. Local businesses shared his photo. Churches held vigils. People who had never met him felt the weight of his absence. Because here's the thing, Sebastian wasn't just a statistic. He was a kid who deserved to grow up, to figure out who he was, to celebrate his 16th birthday, which was just weeks away when he vanished. He was someone's son, someone's classmate, someone's neighbor. And when a child like Sebastian, who relies on the adults around him to keep him safe, disappears without a trace, it's not just a tragedy, it's a failure of protection, a failure of accountability, and possibly a failure of truth. Sebastian Rogers mattered, not because of what happened to him, but because of who he was, a boy who loved routine, who needed stability, who trusted the people closest to him to do right by him. And when those people start telling a story that doesn't match the evidence, when their words contradict the forensics, when their behavior raises more questions than answers, that's when we have to ask, who was really protecting Sebastian, and who was protecting themselves? What time is it where you are right now? Let me know in the comments. February 25th, 2024, a Sunday night in Hendersonville, Tennessee. According to Katie and Chris Proudfoot, it was just another evening. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary, just a normal night. That phrase, normal night, would become a mantra in the days and weeks that followed. Katie repeated it in interview after interview, like a script she'd memorized. It was a normal night. Everything was calm. There was no conflict. But let's walk through what normal actually looked like, according to the timeline they provided. Sebastian came home from school that day. Katie said he seemed fine, no different than usual. He ate dinner with the family, spent some time in his room, maybe played on his devices. Standard stuff for a 5-year-old, especially one who found comfort in routine. Chris was home too. He and Katie were both there, both present, both aware of Sebastian's movements throughout the house. There was no mention of arguments, no mention of discipline, no mention of anything that would suggest tension or conflict. Just normal. Katie would later emphasize this point repeatedly. There was no punishment that night, no yelling, no confrontation. She wanted everyone to know that Sebastian went to bed peacefully, that there was no reason for him to be upset, no reason for him to want to leave. But here's where things start to get interesting. Chris Proudfoot mentioned in multiple interviews that he was on the phone that night. Not just a quick call, a 3-hour phone call, from 9:43 p.m. until nearly 1 a.m. 3 hours. Think about that for a second. Who talks on the phone for 3 hours in the middle of the night when you've got a household to manage, a teenager in the house, and work the next day? Chris said it was a personal call, nothing unusual, just catching up with someone. He was very specific about the time. 9:43 p.m. to 12:43 a.m., down to the minute. But here's the kicker. Katie didn't remember this call at all. When she was asked about the timeline, when she was asked what happened that night, she never mentioned a 3-hour phone call. Not once. It wasn't until Chris brought it up, inserted it into the narrative, that it became part of the official story. And even then, Katie didn't elaborate. She didn't confirm it. She just went along with it. Now, if your partner was on the phone for 3 hours the night your child disappeared, wouldn't you remember that? Wouldn't that be a detail that stuck with you? Especially when investigators are asking you to account for every minute of that evening? But Katie forgot. Or maybe she never knew. Or maybe, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, maybe it didn't happen the way Chris said it did. According to Katie, Sebastian went to bed around 10 or 11 p.m. She said goodnight to him, told him to get some rest. Everything was fine. But then, in one interview, she slipped. She said, "He went to bed." Then she paused, corrected herself and said, I told him to go to bed." That's not a small correction. That's a narrative adjustment. Because there's a difference between a kid going to bed on his own and a parent telling a kid to go to bed. One suggests autonomy, the other suggests control. And in a household where discipline was reportedly an issue, where CPS had been involved, where a stepfather had been accused of using a belt, that distinction matters. Katie's correction suggests she was trying to align her story with a version that had already been established, a version that wasn't hers, a version that came from Chris. Chris Proudfoot was very clear about when Sebastian disappeared. He established a precise window, 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. He said it with confidence, with certainty, as if he had personally verified every minute of that time frame. But here's the problem. Chris wasn't even in Sebastian's room during those hours. He wasn't monitoring the door. He wasn't checking on the boy throughout the night. So how could he be so sure? How could he narrow it down to a 6-hour window with such precision when he had no direct observation of Sebastian during that time? The answer is simple. He couldn't. Not unless he knew something Katie didn't. Not unless he was working backward from a conclusion he'd already reached. Katie, on the other hand, was far less certain. When asked about the timeline, she hesitated. She deferred to Chris. She said things like, "I think it was around that time," or "Chris would know better than me." For a mother who was supposedly the last person to see her son alive, that level of uncertainty is strange. You'd think she'd remember. You'd think the details would be seared into her memory. But instead, she handed the narrative over to Chris. Let him fill in the blanks. Let him control the story. The morning of February 26th, Katie woke up and realized Sebastian wasn't in his room. She said she checked around the house, looked outside, called his name. Nothing. That's when she called the police. The official report came in around 6:30 a.m. Sebastian Rogers, 15 years old, autistic, non-verbal in stressful situations, was missing from his home in Hendersonville. Law enforcement responded quickly. Officers arrived at the scene, began canvassing the area, asking questions, trying to piece together what happened. And that's when the inconsistencies started to pile up. Because the story Katie and Chris were telling, the story of a boy who simply walked out the door in the middle of the night, didn't match what investigators were finding, or more accurately, what they weren't finding. There were no footprints leading away from the house. The ground around the property was soft enough to leave impressions, but there was nothing. No small shoe prints, no disturbance in the soil, no trail leading into the woods or down the driveway. It was as if Sebastian had evaporated into thin air. The K9 units were brought in, trained search dogs that can pick up a scent trail from miles away. They circled the property, noses to the ground, searching for any trace of Sebastian, and they found nothing. No scent trail leading away from the home, no indication that Sebastian had walked, run, or been carried beyond the immediate vicinity. In fact, the dogs showed interest inside the house, not outside. They hit on areas within the home, suggesting that whatever happened to Sebastian, it likely started there. There were no missing shoes. Sebastian's shoes were still in the house, all of them. Now, think about that. You're a 5-year-old kid, it's the middle of winter in Tennessee, it's cold outside, and you're going to walk out into the night, barefoot? That doesn't make sense. Not for any teenager, and especially not for a kid like Sebastian, who relied on routine and predictability. He wouldn't just leave without shoes, he wouldn't leave without a plan. And then there's the door that Katie said Sebastian walked out of. It was found locked, not unlocked, not ajar, locked from the inside. So, if Sebastian walked out, who locked the door behind him? Did he reach back inside and turn the lock before disappearing into the night? Did someone else lock it after he left? Or, and this is the question investigators were starting to ask, did Sebastian never leave through that door at all? Cameras in the area picked up nothing. No footage of a boy walking down the street. No shadowy figure moving through the neighborhood. No cars stopping. No strangers lurking. No sign of Sebastian anywhere. In a world where nearly every home has a doorbell camera, where traffic cams and security systems are everywhere, Sebastian Rogers vanished without leaving a single digital footprint. So what should have been there, but wasn't? Everything. Footprints, scent, shoes, camera footage, witnesses, evidence. All the things that should exist when a person leaves a location were absent, and in their place was a story. A story told by two people, a story that kept changing, a story that didn't match the facts. And the more investigators dug, the more that story started to fall apart. When the call came in on the morning of February 26, 2024, the Hendersonville Police Department didn't waste time. A missing autistic teenager in the middle of winter, that's every law enforcement agency's worst nightmare. Within hours, the response escalated from a local missing persons case to a full-scale multi-agency operation. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the TBI, was brought in almost immediately. They don't get called for routine runaways. They get called when something feels off, when the circumstances don't add up, when there's a possibility that foul play might be involved. And from the very beginning, this case had all the hallmarks of something more than a kid who wandered off. The FBI joined shortly after, lending their resources, their expertise, and their behavioral analysts to the effort. This wasn't just Hendersonville's problem anymore. This was a case that had the attention of state and federal authorities. The search effort was massive. We're talking hundreds of volunteers, law enforcement officers from multiple counties, K9 units, helicopters with thermal imaging, drones scanning the terrain, and search and rescue teams combing through every inch of the surrounding area. The woods near the Proudfoot home were dense, thick with brush and uneven terrain. If Sebastian had wandered into those woods, especially at night, it would have been easy to get disoriented, to get lost. But the search teams were thorough. They covered miles of forest, checked abandoned buildings, searched near bodies of water, looked in drainage ditches, under bridges, anywhere a confused or frightened teenager might have ended up, and they found nothing. The community rallied in a way that only small towns can. Neighbors who'd never met Sebastian showed up to search. Local businesses printed flyers, donated food and water to the search teams, kept their eyes open for any sign of the missing boy. Churches held prayer vigils, schools sent out alerts, social media exploded with shares, reposts, and pleas for information. Sebastian's face was everywhere on Facebook, on local news stations, on missing persons websites. The hashtag number #FindSebastian trended across Tennessee and beyond. People wanted to believe he was out there somewhere, alive, waiting to be found. They wanted to believe that this was just a tragic misunderstanding, that Sebastian had gotten confused, wandered off, and would turn up cold and scared, but otherwise, okay. That's the story everyone wanted. But as the hours turned into days, and the days turned into weeks, that story became harder and harder to believe. The media coverage was relentless. Local news stations camped out near the Proudfoot home, interviewing neighbors, broadcasting updates, showing footage of the search efforts. National outlets picked up the story. CNN, Fox News, NBC, they all ran segments on the missing Tennessee boy, and with that media attention came scrutiny. Reporters started asking questions, not just about Sebastian, but about his home life, about his family, about the people who were supposed to be keeping him safe. Katie and Chris Proudfoot became the faces of the case. They did interview after interview, appearing on camera to plead for Sebastian's safe return, to ask the public for help, to insist that they had no idea what happened. But the more they talked, the more people started to notice things. The way Chris dominated every conversation, the way Katie deferred to him, looked to him for answers, corrected herself mid-sentence when her story didn't align with his, the way their body language seemed off, stiff, rehearsed. Early on, there were two competing theories. The first, and the one that Katie and Chris pushed hard, was that Sebastian had run away, that he'd gotten upset about something, though they couldn't say what, and decided to leave in the middle of the night. It was a theory that, on the surface, seemed plausible. Teenagers run away all the time, right? They get into arguments with their parents, they feel misunderstood, they want to assert their independence. It happens, but the problem with that theory is that Sebastian wasn't a typical teenager. He was autistic. He struggled with communication. He relied on routine and structure. He didn't have a history of running away. He didn't have friends he could crash with, places he could go, a network of people who would help him disappear. And most importantly, he didn't have shoes. He didn't have a coat. He didn't have a phone. If he ran away, he did it in the worst possible way, under the worst possible conditions, with the worst possible chances of survival. The second theory, the one that law enforcement was quietly considering but not publicly confirming, was foul play. That something had happened to Sebastian inside the home, and that his disappearance wasn't voluntary. It was a theory that made a lot of people uncomfortable, because it meant looking at the people closest to him, his mother, his stepfather, as potential suspects. But in cases like this, that's where you have to start. Statistically, when a child goes missing, the answer is almost always found within the family. And the red flags were piling up fast. The K9 units, those highly trained search dogs that can track a scent for miles, found no trail leading away from the house. None. They circled the property, worked the perimeter, extended their search into the surrounding woods and streets, and came up empty. But here's what they did find. Interest inside the home. The dogs alerted to specific areas within the house, suggesting that Sebastian's scent was concentrated there, not outside. That's not what you'd expect if a boy had walked out the front door and disappeared into the night. There were no footprints. The ground around the Proudfoot home wasn't concrete or pavement, it was soil, grass, soft earth that would have easily captured impressions from someone walking through it. Search teams documented the area extensively, and there were no small footprints, no barefoot impressions, No sign that anyone had walked away from that house. It was as if Sebastian had simply vanished from his bedroom without ever touching the ground outside. The cameras told the same story, or rather, they told no story at all. In a neighborhood where doorbell cameras and security systems are common, where traffic cameras monitor intersections, where nearly every movement is captured on some kind of recording device, there was no footage of Sebastian. Not walking down the street, not getting into a car, not standing on a corner looking confused. Nothing. In the digital age, it's almost impossible to move through a populated area without being seen by a camera. But Sebastian Rogers managed to do exactly that, if you believe he ever left the house at all. Law enforcement wasn't saying much publicly, but their actions spoke volumes. They weren't treating this like a runaway case. They were treating it like a criminal investigation. They were interviewing family members, friends, neighbors. They were looking at phone records, text messages, social media activity. They were building a timeline, checking alibis, searching for inconsistencies, and the more they dug, the more the focus seemed to shift back to the Proudfoot home. Because here's the thing, when a child disappears and there's no evidence that they ever left the location where they were last seen, you have to start asking a very uncomfortable question. Did they ever leave at all? Or is someone lying about what really happened that night? The search for Sebastian Rogers was one of the most extensive efforts Sumner County had ever seen, but as the days wore on, as the leads dried up, as the physical evidence continued to point toward an impossibility, investigators were left with a haunting reality. They weren't looking for a runaway. They were looking for answers, and those answers, they suspected, were locked inside a house in Hendersonville, hidden behind a narrative that was starting to crumble under scrutiny. Let's talk about the official story, the one Katie and Chris Proudfoot want you to believe, the one they've repeated in interview after interview, with slight variations but always the same core message. Sebastian walked out on his own. He left the house sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. on February 26, 2024. He opened the door, stepped out into the cold Tennessee night, and disappeared. No one saw him leave. No one heard him leave. He just left. It's a simple story. Clean, convenient, and if you don't look too closely, it almost makes sense. Teenagers run away all the time, right? They get upset. They feel misunderstood. They want to escape. It happens. But here's the problem. When you actually examine the evidence, or more accurately, the complete and total absence of evidence, the runaway theory doesn't just fall apart. It disintegrates. It becomes not just unlikely, but impossible. There are 12 major contradictions, 12 forensic impossibilities that cannot coexist with the idea that Sebastian Rogers voluntarily walked out of his home that night. Let's go through them, one by one, and you tell me if this sounds like a runaway to you. No footprints. Let's start with the most basic, most fundamental piece of evidence that should exist if someone walked away from a location. Footprints. The area around the Proudfoot home wasn't solid concrete or asphalt. It was a mix of soil, grass, soft ground, the kind of terrain that captures impressions easily. When search teams arrived, they documented everything. They photographed the property, measured distances, looked for any sign that someone had walked through the area, and they found nothing. No small shoe prints, no barefoot impressions, no disturbance in the soil that would indicate a 5-year-old boy had walked across it. Now, think about that. Sebastian weighed around 120 pounds. He wasn't a ghost. If he walked out of that house, across that yard, and into the surrounding area, he would have left marks. But there were none. It's as if he floated away. Or, and this is the more logical conclusion, he never left at all. No scent trail. This one's huge. K9 units are brought into missing persons cases for one reason: they work. These dogs are trained to pick up human scent and follow it for miles, even days after a person has passed through an area. When the search dogs arrived at the Proudfoot home, they were given Sebastian's scent from his clothing, his bedding, his personal items. Then they were released to track. And you know what they found? Nothing. No trail leading away from the house. No scent path into the woods, down the street, toward a neighbor's property. The dogs circled, searched, worked the area extensively, and came up empty. That's not normal. If Sebastian had walked out of that house even hours earlier, those dogs would have picked up something. But they didn't, because there was nothing to pick up. No missing shoes. Here's where it gets really absurd. It was late February in Tennessee. Nighttime temperatures were in the low 40 seconds, maybe dipping into the 30 seconds, cold enough that you'd want a jacket, long sleeves, and definitely shoes. But when investigators checked Sebastian's room, all of his shoes were still there, every single pair. So if he left the house, he left barefoot. Now, I want you to picture this. You're a 5-year-old kid. It's the middle of the night. It's cold. You're about to walk out into the darkness, away from your home, with no plan, no destination, no idea where you're going. And you don't put on shoes? You don't grab a coat? You don't take your phone? That's not how people behave. That's not how anyone behaves, let alone a kid with autism who relies on routine and logic. If Sebastian left voluntarily, he would have prepared. He would have taken the basics. But he didn't. Because he didn't leave. Locked door. This is one of the most damning pieces of evidence. The door that Sebastian supposedly walked out of, it was found locked. From the inside. Let that sink in. If Sebastian opened that door, walked out, and closed it behind him, who locked it? Did he reach back inside and turn the deadbolt before vanishing into the night? Did he have a key and lock it from the outside? Or did someone else lock it after he left? None of those scenarios make sense. The simplest explanation, the one that actually fits the evidence, is that the door was never opened, that Sebastian never walked through it, that the whole story is a fabrication designed to point investigators away from what really happened inside that house. No camera footage. We live in the age of surveillance. Doorbell cameras, security systems, traffic cams, gas station footage, everything is recorded. The neighborhood where the Proudfoots lived wasn't some remote rural area. It was a residential community with homes, streets, and yes, cameras. When investigators canvassed the area, they pulled footage from every available source, and they found nothing. No image of Sebastian walking down the street, no shadowy figure moving through a yard, no boy standing on a corner looking lost. In a world where it's almost impossible to move through a populated area without being captured on camera, Sebastian Rogers managed to disappear without leaving a single frame of video evidence. That's not just unlikely, that's impossible. Unless, of course, he never left the property. No audio cues. Katie and Chris both claimed they heard nothing unusual that night. No door opening, no footsteps, no creaking floorboards, no sound of Sebastian moving through the house. Now, if you've ever lived in a house with a teenager, you know they're not exactly stealthy. Doors squeak, floors creak, things get bumped into. But according to Katie and Chris, Sebastian managed to get out of bed, walk through the house, unlock and open a door, and leave without making a single sound. And this is a kid who, according to his family, wasn't trying to sneak out. He wasn't running away from an argument. He just left, silently, in the middle of the night, without waking anyone. Does that sound believable to you? No disturbed ground. Beyond the lack of footprints, there was no disturbance in the surrounding area at all. No broken branches, no trampled grass, no signs that anyone had moved through the woods or fields near the home. Search teams covered miles of terrain, and everything was undisturbed. If Sebastian had walked into those woods, especially at night, in the dark, without shoes, there would have been signs, broken twigs, displaced leaves, something, but there was nothing. The environment around the Proudfoot home looked exactly as it should if no one had passed through it, because no one had. Autism-related behavioral patterns. Let's talk about Sebastian's autism for a second. Kids on the spectrum often rely heavily on routine, predictability, and structure. They don't typically engage in impulsive, unplanned behavior, especially behavior that involves leaving a safe, familiar environment for an unknown, potentially dangerous one. Sebastian wasn't the kind of kid who'd just decide, on a whim, to walk out into the night with no destination, no plan, no resources. That's not how his brain worked. His autism made him more dependent on stability, not less. The idea that he would suddenly, without warning, without reason, leave his home in the middle of the night goes against everything we know about his psychological profile. No prior runaway history. Sebastian had never run away before, not once. There were no previous incidents of him leaving the house without permission, no history of defiance or rebellion, no pattern of behavior that would suggest he was the type of kid who'd bolt. In fact, those who knew him said the opposite, that he was compliant, that he followed rules, that he stayed close to home. So why would he suddenly, on this particular night, decide to run? What changed? What triggered it? Katie and Chris can't answer that question, because there is no answer. There was no trigger, no motive, no reason, because it didn't happen. No motive or trigger. This ties directly into the previous point. For someone to run away, there's usually a catalyst, a fight, a punishment, a conflict, something that makes them feel like they need to escape. But Katie insists over and over again that the night Sebastian disappeared was calm, normal, no arguments, no discipline, no tension. So if everything was fine, if there was no conflict, if Sebastian had no reason to be upset, why would he leave? The runaway theory requires a motive, and there isn't one. At least, not one that Katie and Chris are willing to admit. No sightings despite massive search. Hundreds of people searched for Sebastian. Law enforcement, volunteers, trained search and rescue teams. They covered miles of terrain, knocked on doors, checked businesses, reviewed footage, interviewed witnesses. And in all of that effort, not a single person reported seeing Sebastian. Not one. No sightings at gas stations, no reports of a boy walking alone on the side of the road, no tips from drivers who might have passed him. In a case this high profile, with this much media coverage, someone would have seen something. But no one did, because there was nothing to see. Forensic dogs hit inside the home, not outside. This is the final nail in the coffin. When the K9 units were brought in, they didn't just fail to find a scent trail leading away from the house. They actively alerted inside the home. The dogs showed interest in specific areas within the house, indicating that Sebastian's scent was concentrated there. That's not what you'd expect if a boy had walked out the front door and disappeared. That's what you'd expect if something happened to him inside, and his body or evidence of what happened was still in that location. The dogs don't lie. They follow the scent. And the scent led them back to the house, not away from it. So let's recap. No footprints, no scent trail, no missing shoes, locked door, no camera footage, no audio cues, no disturbed ground, behavioral patterns that contradict the theory, no prior history, no motive, no sightings, and forensic dogs that point back to the house. 12 impossibilities, 12 pieces of evidence or lack thereof that completely dismantle the runaway narrative. This wasn't a runaway. It couldn't have been. The evidence doesn't support it. The logic doesn't support it. The forensics don't support it. So if Sebastian didn't walk out of that house on his own, then what happened? What's the alternative? And why are Katie and Chris Proudfoot so insistent on pushing a story that the evidence clearly contradicts? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how disturbing, must be the truth. And the truth, in this case, points inward, not outward. It points to the house, to the people inside, to a narrative that was constructed not to find Sebastian, but to protect someone. If you're finding this case as disturbing as I am, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think happened. If you've ever watched someone try to remember a story they didn't actually experience, you know what it looks like. There's hesitation, there are pauses. They look to the side, searching for details that should come naturally, but don't. They correct themselves mid-sentence, not because they misspoke, but because they're trying to align what they're saying with a version of events they've been told to repeat. That's Katie Proudfoot. In every interview, in every public appearance, she doesn't come across as a mother recounting the night her son disappeared. She comes across as someone trying very, very hard to remember someone else's script. Katie isn't the architect of the narrative surrounding Sebastian's disappearance. She's the person tasked with selling it, and the cracks in her performance are everywhere. Let's start with the slips, the moments where her words betray what she's really thinking, what she might actually know, or what she's been told to say. These aren't just minor mistakes, they're linguistic red flags that reveal the difference between someone recalling a genuine memory and someone repeating a manufactured story. One of the most chilling examples is her use of past tense when talking about Sebastian. In one interview, she said, "He would have turned 16. Not, he will turn 16. Not, he's going to turn 16. But would have as if his 16th birthday was already a missed event, a moment that had passed, a future that no longer existed. That's not the language of hope. That's the language of grief. It's the kind of phrasing you use when you've already accepted, on some level, that the person you're talking about isn't coming back. Now, you might argue that's just a slip of the tongue, that people under stress say things they don't mean. And sure, that's possible. But it's not an isolated incident. Katie made similar slips multiple times in the first week after Sebastian disappeared. She talked about him in ways that suggested finality, not possibility. She spoke as if she was mourning, not searching. And that's a problem, because a parent who genuinely believes their child is out there, alive, waiting to be found, doesn't talk like that. They hold on to hope. They use present tense. They say things like, when we find him, not if we find him. Katie's language suggests she's already processed an outcome the rest of us aren't supposed to know about yet. Then there's the big one, the slip that, in my opinion, reveals more than anything else she said. I don't know why he walked out that door. Let's break that down. I don't know why he walked out that door. Not, I don't know where he is. Not, I don't know what happened. But I don't know why he walked out. She's presupposing an action for which there is zero physical evidence. No footprints, no scent trail, no camera footage, no witnesses, nothing that suggests Sebastian walked out of that house. And yet, Katie speaks as if it's a fact, as if she knows he walked out. She just doesn't know why. How does she know that? How can she be certain of an event that left no trace? The only way that sentence makes sense is if someone told her that's what happened. If someone constructed a narrative Sebastian walked out on his own, and she's repeating it, even though she didn't witness it, even though the evidence doesn't support it. That's not a mother recalling what she saw. That's a mother repeating what she was told to say. And then there are the self-corrections. These are subtle, but they're everywhere. In one interview, Katie starts to say, he went to bed, then catches herself and changes it to, I told him to go to bed. That's not a casual rephrasing. That's a narrative adjustment, because there's a difference between those two statements. He went to bed suggests autonomy, a kid making his own decision. I told him to go to bed suggests control, a parent giving an instruction. And in a household where discipline was reportedly an issue, where there were allegations of harsh punishment, that distinction matters. Why did she correct herself? Because she was trying to stay aligned with a version of events that had already been established. A version where everything was calm, where there was no conflict, where Sebastian was told to go to bed, and he complied without issue. But her initial phrasing, he went to bed, suggests a different reality. One where maybe things weren't so calm. One where maybe there was tension, resistance, a reason for discipline. She caught herself before she said too much, and she course-corrected. That's not how memory works. That's how rehearsed testimony works. Katie also has a habit of avoiding direct questions, and I don't mean she gives vague answers. I mean she completely sidesteps the question and replaces it with a scripted response. When reporters ask if Sebastian was punished that night, she doesn't say yes or no. She says, it was a normal night. When they ask if there was any conflict, any argument, any tension in the house, she says, everything was calm. When they bring up the CPS allegations, the reports of Chris using a belt on Sebastian, she deflects entirely. She doesn't deny it. She doesn't defend Chris. She just moves on. That's avoidance. And avoidance is a red flag. Because if the answer to those questions was simply, no, there was no punishment, no conflict, no issues, she'd say that. She'd be clear, direct, emphatic. But instead, she hides behind generalities. Normal night, calm evening, everything was fine. Those aren't answers, they're shields. They're designed to shut down the line of questioning without actually addressing it. And that tells you something. It tells you there's something she doesn't want to talk about, something she's been told not to talk about, or something she's protecting. Now let's talk about her dependence on Chris, because this is where things get really uncomfortable. In every interview, Katie defers to Chris. She looks at him before answering questions. She pauses when he moves or reacts. She falls silent when he interjects, even when the question was directed specifically at her. It's like she's waiting for permission to speak or checking to make sure she's saying the right thing. That's not the behavior of an equal partner. That's the behavior of someone who's subordinate, someone who's been conditioned to follow someone else's lead. There's a moment in one of the interviews where a reporter asks Katie a direct question about the timeline. She starts to answer, then glances at Chris. He shifts in his seat, and she stops mid-sentence. Then Chris jumps in and answers for her, providing a level of detail and precision that Katie never mentioned, and she just lets him. She doesn't correct him, doesn't add anything, doesn't assert her own version of events. She defers completely. That dynamic is textbook. It's what you see in relationships where one partner holds all the power and the other partner has learned to stay in line. It's what you see in cases where one person is controlling the narrative and the other person is tasked with supporting it, even if they don't fully understand it or believe it. Katie isn't an independent witness. She's an extension of Chris's story, and that makes her testimony unreliable not because she's intentionally lying, but because she's not speaking from her own memory. She's speaking from his script. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that Katie Proudfoot is what forensic psychologists call a secondary narrator. She's not the person who created the story. She's the person trying to maintain it, and that's a much harder job. Because when you're repeating someone else's narrative, you don't have the cognitive framework to support it. You don't have the real memories to anchor the details. You're working from a script, and scripts are fragile. They fall apart under pressure. They produce slips, contradictions, and inconsistencies, exactly what we see with Katie. Think of it like this. If I asked you to describe what you did last Tuesday, you'd be able to tell me. You might not remember every detail, but you'd have a general sense of the day. You'd recall key moments, interactions, feelings. Your story would be fluid, natural, consistent. But if I asked you to describe what someone else told you they did last Tuesday, and you had to repeat it as if you experienced it yourself, you'd struggle, you'd hesitate, you'd second-guess yourself, you'd correct details to match what you were told. That's what Katie sounds like. She's not recalling, she's repeating. And here's the thing, this doesn't necessarily mean Katie is a willing participant in a cover-up. It's entirely possible that she's a victim in this situation too, that she's in a controlling, possibly abusive relationship with Chris, that she's been manipulated, coerced, or conditioned to support his version of events out of fear, dependency, or emotional survival. Women in these kinds of dynamics often do exactly what Katie's doing. They minimize conflict. They protect their partner. They adopt the partner's narrative, even when it contradicts their own experience, because that's what they've been trained to do. But whether she's a willing participant or a coerced one, the result is the same. Her testimony is compromised, her story doesn't hold up, and the more she talks, the more it becomes clear that she's not the one in control of the narrative. Chris is. She's just the person trying to make it sound believable. The forensic conclusion here is straightforward. Katie Proudfoot is not the originator of the story surrounding Sebastian's disappearance. She's the person tasked with legitimizing it. Her slips, the past tense, the presuppositions, the self-corrections reveal the gaps between what she's been told to say and what she actually knows. Her avoidance of direct questions shows that there are topics she's been instructed not to address, and her dependence on Chris demonstrates that she's not functioning as an independent witness. She's functioning as a supporting character in someone else's script. And when you're trying to maintain a story you didn't create, especially one that contradicts the physical evidence, the cracks are inevitable. Katie's cracks are showing, and the more investigators dig, the more those cracks are going to widen. What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny? Rainy? Let me know. If Katie Proudfoot is the person trying to sell the story, Chris Proudfoot is the person who wrote it. And he doesn't just tell the story, he controls it, shapes it, defends it, and shuts down anyone who questions it. In every interview, in every public appearance, Chris doesn't come across as a grieving stepfather desperate to find his missing stepson. He comes across as a man on a mission to manage the narrative, to control the flow of information, and to make absolutely certain that the public and law enforcement see this case the way he wants them to see it. Chris Proudfoot is the architect, and the blueprint he's working from has one goal: keep the focus anywhere but on him. Let's start with the most obvious behavioral red flag: his dominance. In every single interview, Chris talks more than Katie, not just a little more, significantly more. We're talking 80%, sometimes 90% of the conversation. Even when questions are directed specifically at Katie, even when the reporter is clearly asking for her perspective, Chris jumps in. He answers for her. He clarifies for her. He corrects her. He doesn't let her speak independently, and when she does manage to get a word in, He's right there, hovering, ready to redirect if she starts to veer off script. That's not support. That's control. A supportive partner would step back, let the other person speak, offer comfort when needed. Chris does the opposite. He dominates the space, monopolizes the conversation, and positions himself as the authoritative voice on what happened. But here's the problem. Katie was the last person to see Sebastian alive, not Chris. She's the one who should be providing the details, the timeline, the observations. But Chris speaks as if he was there, as if he has first-hand knowledge of events he couldn't possibly have witnessed. That's not normal. That's a red flag the size of Texas. And it's not just that he talks more, it's how he talks. Chris uses what investigators call hyper-precision. He provides exact timestamps, down to the minute. He'll say things like, the phone call started at 9:43 p.m. and ended at 12:43 a.m., not around 9:45, not sometime before midnight, but 9:43. Exactly. That level of specificity would normally suggest reliability, right? Someone who remembers details that clearly must be telling the truth. But in forensic psychology, hyper-precision is actually a warning sign, because real memory doesn't work that way. Real memory is fluid, approximate, contextual. You remember the general flow of events, the key moments, the emotional beats. You don't remember exact timestamps unless you were watching the clock for a specific reason or unless you're constructing a timeline after the fact to support a predetermined narrative. And here's the kicker. Katie doesn't remember that phone call at all. Chris brings it up, inserts it into the timeline, and suddenly it becomes a crucial part of the story. But Katie never mentioned it. She didn't recall a 3-hour phone call happening the night her son disappeared. That's not a small detail to forget. That's a massive chunk of time, a significant event that should have stuck in her memory. But it didn't, because maybe it didn't happen the way Chris says it did, or maybe it happened, but it wasn't just a casual conversation. Maybe something else was going on during those 3 hours, something Chris doesn't want to talk about. Chris also uses a lot of procedural language terminology you'd expect from law enforcement, not from a civilian. He talks about being vetted by the FBI. He mentions inter-agency coordination. He discusses investigative positioning and clearance protocols. He speaks like someone who's either spent a lot of time around cops or someone who's done a lot of research into how investigations work. And that raises a question. Why? Why does Chris Proudfoot sound like he's reading from a police manual? Why is he so familiar with investigative procedures? And why is he so insistent on telling everyone that he's been cleared, that he's been vetted, that law enforcement has ruled him out? Because here's the thing. They haven't. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, the Hendersonville Police Department, none of them have publicly stated that Chris or Katie Proudfoot have been cleared. In fact, their official position is the opposite. They've said, repeatedly, that everything is still on the table, that they're not ruling anyone out, that the investigation is ongoing, and all possibilities are being considered. So when Chris claims he's been vetted, when he asserts that law enforcement has cleared him, he's either lying or he's deeply confused about what cleared actually means. This is what's called self-clearing behavior. It's a documented psychological pattern where a person attempts to preempt suspicion by falsely asserting investigative approval. It's the equivalent of saying, "You don't need to look at me, the cops already did, and I'm good." But that only works if it's true. And in this case, it's not. Chris is trying to shut down scrutiny before it even starts. He's trying to position himself as someone who's already been investigated and exonerated, so the public and the media will move on and look elsewhere. But investigators haven't moved on, and they're not looking elsewhere. They're looking right at him. Now let's talk about the language Chris uses when he refers to the people in his life, because this is where things get really unsettling. Chris doesn't call Katie by her name. He doesn't say, "my wife," or "Katie." He calls her the mom, not his mom, not Sebastian's mom, just the mom, like she's a role, a function, not a person. And when he talks about Sebastian, he doesn't say, "my stepson," or "Sebastian," or even "the boy." He says, "the young man." That's distancing language. It's a phenomenon recognized in forensic linguistics, where a person removes emotional connection or ownership from the people they're talking about. It's a way of creating psychological separation, of depersonalizing the relationship. And it's something that shows up a lot in cases involving harm to children, especially in households where the perpetrator is a step-parent or non-biological caregiver. When someone refers to a child they're supposed to care about as the young man, instead of using their name, it signals detachment. It signals a lack of emotional investment. It signals that the relationship isn't what it should be. Compare that to how most step-parents talk about their stepkids, especially in a crisis. They say things like, "our son," "my boy," "Sebastian." They use possessive, affectionate language because they want to communicate that they care, that they're invested, that this child matters to them. Chris does the opposite. He creates distance. He removes intimacy. He speaks about Sebastian and Katie like they're characters in a story he's narrating, not people he loves and is desperate to protect. And then there are the CPS allegations. Now, I want to be clear, these are allegations. They haven't been proven in court, but they also can't be dismissed because they fit a pattern. Multiple reports were made to Child Protective Services regarding Chris Proudfoot's treatment of Sebastian. Reports that Chris used a belt on the boy. Reports of escalating discipline. Reports from prior relationships involving Chris and other children, suggesting a history of harsh, potentially abusive behavior. Again, none of this has been legally substantiated. But in the context of a missing child case, these reports matter because they establish a risk profile. Step-parents are statistically overrepresented in cases of child harm. That's not an opinion, that's data. Children living with a step-parent, particularly a stepfather, face a higher risk of abuse and neglect than children living with both biological parents. It's an uncomfortable truth, but it's a truth nonetheless. And when you add autism into the mix, that risk increases even further. Autistic children are more vulnerable because they may struggle to communicate what's happening to them. They may not understand that what's being done to them is wrong. They may not have the social skills or the language to report abuse, to ask for help, to remove themselves from a dangerous situation. Sebastian was autistic. He lived with a stepfather who had a documented history of CPS involvement. He was in a household where discipline was reportedly strict, where conflict may have been more common than Katie wants to admit, and where the power dynamic was clearly skewed in Chris's favor. That's not speculation, that's a risk assessment. And it's the kind of risk assessment that investigators take very seriously when a child goes missing under suspicious circumstances. So let's put it all together. Chris dominates every interview, controls the narrative, and speaks with a level of precision that suggests fabrication rather than recall. He uses procedural language to position himself as someone who's been cleared by law enforcement, even though he hasn't been. He refers to Katie and Sebastian with distancing language that removes emotional connection and suggests detachment. He has a history of CPS allegations involving harsh discipline and prior incidents with other children. And he's a step-parent in a household with an autistic child, a combination that statistically elevates the risk of harm. Now, does any of that prove Chris Proudfoot harmed Sebastian? No, not on its own. But it paints a picture of a man who doesn't behave like a desperate stepfather searching for a missing child. A picture of a man who behaves like someone managing a crisis, controlling a narrative, and protecting himself from scrutiny. Think about how a genuinely innocent person behaves in a situation like this. They're frantic, they're emotional, they defer to law enforcement, they beg the public for help, they focus entirely on finding the missing child, not on defending themselves or asserting their innocence. They don't dominate interviews. They don't correct their partner's statements. They don't use procedural jargon or claim they've been vetted when they haven't. They don't create emotional distance from the victim. They don't act like they're in control, they act like they're falling apart. Chris Proudfoot is not falling apart. He's composed, he's strategic, he's calculated, and that's a problem, because when a child goes missing, the people closest to that child should be the most visibly affected. They should be the ones who can barely hold it together, but Chris holds it together just fine. In fact, he holds it together so well that it starts to feel rehearsed, scripted, managed. And then there's the way he shuts down alternative theories. Anytime someone suggests that maybe Sebastian didn't run away, that maybe something else happened, Chris is quick to dismiss it. He'll say things like, "That's not what the evidence shows," or "Law enforcement has already looked into that," or People are just speculating. He positions himself as the gatekeeper of what's plausible, what's worth considering, what's even worth discussing. But he's not an investigator. He's not a forensic expert. He's a stepfather. So why is he so confident in determining what did or didn't happen? Why is he so invested in narrowing the possibilities down to one single theory, the runaway theory, when the evidence clearly contradicts it? Because that theory is the only one that doesn't point back at him. If Sebastian ran away, then Chris isn't responsible. If Sebastian walked out on his own, then whatever happened to him happened out there, not in here. If the focus stays on the woods, the streets, the possibility that Sebastian is lost or taken by a stranger, then investigators aren't looking at the house. They're not looking at the family. They're not looking at Chris. And that's exactly what he wants. But investigators are smarter than that. They know that when a child disappears, and there's no evidence they ever left the location where they were last seen, you start with the people who had access to that child. You start with the household. You start with the adults who were responsible for keeping that child safe. And in this case, that means Chris and Katie Proudfoot. Katie's behavior suggests she's a secondary narrator, someone trying to maintain a story she didn't create. Chris's behavior suggests he's the primary narrator, the person who constructed the story in the first place. He's the one with the motive to control the narrative. He's the one with the history of alleged harsh discipline. He's the one with the statistical risk profile. He's the one who speaks with hyper-precision, uses distancing language, engages in self-clearing behavior, and dominates every conversation to ensure the story stays on track. Chris Proudfoot doesn't act like a man searching for answers. He acts like a man who already knows what happened and is doing everything in his power to make sure no one else figures it out. And that, more than anything else, is why investigators are watching him. Not because they want him to be guilty, but because his behavior, his language, his control over the narrative, and his history all point in one direction, inward, toward the house, toward the night Sebastian disappeared, toward the truth Chris Proudfoot doesn't want anyone to find. Here's what makes this case so disturbing. It's not just that the story doesn't match the evidence. It's that the story itself is being told by two people playing very different roles. Chris constructs the logic. Katie provides the emotional facade. Together, they create what forensic psychologists call a dual narrative model, a two-layered script where one person builds the framework and the other person softens the edges, making it palatable, believable, sympathetic. You've seen this before, even if you didn't realize it. It shows up in domestic cases all the time. One partner is the strategist, the one who thinks 3 steps ahead, who controls the timeline, who makes sure every detail aligns. The other partner is the emotional anchor, the one who cries on cue, who appeals to the public's sympathy, who makes the story feel human. Separately, neither one is fully convincing. But together, they create a narrative that's hard to crack, because while you're questioning the logic, the emotion distracts you. And while you're questioning the emotion, the logic reassures you. That's exactly what's happening here. Chris provides the structure. He's the one with the exact timestamps, the procedural language, the firm boundaries around what did and didn't happen. He's the one who says, Sebastian disappeared between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. He's the one who inserts the 3-hour phone call into the timeline. He's the one who asserts that there were no noises, no conflicts, no disturbances. He builds the skeleton of the story, the hard facts, the timeline, the sequence of events, and he does it with such confidence, such precision, that it almost feels authoritative, like he's not guessing, like he knows. Katie, on the other hand, provides the emotional padding. She's the one who says, it was a normal night, everything was calm. She's the one who tears up in interviews, who talks about how much she misses Sebastian, who appeals to the public for help. She's the one who makes you feel something. She's the one who makes you want to believe her, because what kind of monster would suspect a grieving mother? Her role isn't to provide facts, it's to provide feeling, to make the story seem real, human, tragic, to disarm your skepticism with emotion. And here's the thing, it works. At least, it works on a lot of people, because we're wired to respond to emotion. We see a mother crying, and we instinctively want to comfort her, to believe her, to give her the benefit of the doubt. We don't want to think she's lying. We don't want to think she's covering for someone. So we accept the emotional layer at face value, and we don't dig into the logical layer underneath. We don't ask the hard questions. We don't notice the contradictions. But when you strip away the emotion and look at the logic, the whole thing falls apart. Because Chris's timeline doesn't make sense. His hyper-precision is suspicious. His claim that Sebastian walked out between midnight and 6 a.m. is contradicted by every piece of physical evidence. And when you strip away the logic and look at the emotion, that falls apart too. Because Katie slips the past tense, the presuppositions, the self-corrections reveal that she's not speaking from genuine grief. She's speaking from a script she's struggling to remember. So how do their stories interlock? Let me show you. Chris says, Sebastian went to bed around 10 p.m. Everything was normal. I was on the phone from 9:43 p.m. to 12:43 a.m. When Katie checked on him in the morning, he was gone. That's the logical framework. Clear, sequential, precise. Katie says, it was a calm night. No arguments, no punishment. I told him to go to bed, and he did. I don't know why he walked out that door. That's the emotional overlay. Soft, reassuring, sympathetic. On the surface, they align. They're telling the same story. But look closer. Chris provides details Katie doesn't remember. Katie presupposes actions Chris can't confirm. Chris speaks with certainty about a time frame he didn't witness. Katie speaks with emotion about an event she can't explain. Their stories don't actually support each other, they just don't contradict each other enough to be obviously false. And that's the point. The goal isn't to tell the truth. The goal is to tell a story that's hard to disprove. But here's where it gets interesting. Because in cases like this, where one partner constructs the narrative and the other partner confirms it, there's always slippage. The secondary narrator, Katie, in this case, can't maintain the story perfectly because she doesn't have the cognitive framework to support it. She's not working from memory. She's working from instruction. And instructions are fragile. They break down under pressure. They produce contradictions, slips, and inconsistencies. That's why Katie says things like, I don't know why he walked out that door, even though there's no evidence he walked out at all. That's why she corrects herself from, he went to bed to, I told him to go to bed. That's why she avoids direct questions about punishment and conflict. Because she's not recalling events, she's trying to stay aligned with Chris's version. And when the pressure's on, when the questions get too specific, she defaults to the emotional script. It was a normal night. Everything was calm. Because that's what she's been told to say. Now, think about this from an investigator's perspective. You've got two people telling you the same story, but one of them is providing all the details and the other one is just repeating generalities. One of them is hyper-precise and the other one is vague. One of them dominates the conversation and the other one defers. What does that tell you? It tells you that one person knows what happened and the other person is trying to support a version of events they didn't witness. It tells you that the story isn't organic, it's constructed. And when a story is constructed, there's usually a reason. Usually, it's because the truth is something the storyteller doesn't want you to know. This dual narrative model shows up in domestic cases all the time. You see it in cases where a parent harms a child and the other parent covers for them. You see it in cases where one partner commits a crime and the other partner provides an alibi. You see it in cases where the truth is too damaging, too incriminating, too dangerous to admit. So, instead of telling the truth, they build a story. One person constructs it, the other person sells it. And together, they hope it's enough to keep investigators looking in the wrong direction. But it's not enough. Because investigators are trained to spot this pattern. They know what a dual narrative looks like. They know how to separate the logic from the emotion, how to identify the primary narrator and the secondary narrator, how to apply pressure to the weak points in the story until it cracks. And in this case, the weak points are everywhere. Ask yourself this. If Katie genuinely didn't know what happened to Sebastian, why does she speak as if she does? Why does she presuppose actions the evidence doesn't support? Why does she avoid questions about conflict and punishment? And if Chris genuinely wasn't involved, why is he so invested in controlling the narrative? Why does he dominate every interview? Why does he provide details Katie doesn't remember? Why does he use distancing language and self-clearing behavior? The answer is simple. Because they're not telling you what happened. They're telling you what they want you to believe happened. And there's a difference. Here's a hypothetical for you. Let's say something did happen inside that house the night Sebastian disappeared. Let's say there was conflict, punishment, an escalation that went too far. Let's say Chris was involved, and Katie discovered the aftermath. What would you expect to see? You'd expect Chris to construct a narrative that shifts the focus away from the house, away from the family, away from him. You'd expect him to assert control over the story, to provide a timeline that creates distance between himself and the event, to use language that depersonalizes his relationship with the victim. And you'd expect Katie to support that narrative, even if she didn't fully understand it, even if it contradicted her own observations, because she's dependent on him, because she's scared, because she doesn't know what else to do. Sound familiar? That's not proof, but it's a pattern, and patterns matter. Because when behavior aligns with a known forensic model, when the language matches what we see in other cases of this type, when the contradictions and slippage occur in predictable ways, it tells investigators they're on the right track. It tells them the story they're being sold isn't the whole story, and it tells them where to dig deeper. Chris and Katie Proudfoot are functioning as a two-layered script. One layer is logical, precise, and controlling. The other layer is emotional, vague, and deferential. Together, they create a narrative designed to protect someone. And the more you examine that narrative, the more it becomes clear. They're not protecting Sebastian, they're protecting themselves. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We're covering more cases like this every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. There's a reason law enforcement stays quiet in cases like this. It's not because they don't know anything. It's because they know too much. And when you're building a case, especially a case without a body, without a confession, without that one piece of smoking gun evidence, you don't show your hand. You don't tip off the suspects. You don't give them a roadmap of what you've found and what you're still looking for. You stay silent, you watch, you wait, and you let the people involved keep talking, because the more they talk, the more they reveal. That's exactly what's happening in the Sebastian Rogers case. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the Hendersonville Police Department have been very careful about what they say publicly. They've issued statements asking for the public's help. They've shared updates on search efforts. They've emphasized that the investigation is ongoing. But here's what they haven't said. They haven't cleared anyone. Not Katie, not Chris, not anyone in the household. In fact, their official position has been consistent from day one. Everything is still on the table. That's law enforcement speak, for we're not ruling anyone out. It means they're still looking at all possibilities, including the possibility that someone in that house knows more than they're saying. It means they haven't found evidence that exonerates the family. And it means that despite what Chris Proudfoot claims, he has not been vetted, cleared, or ruled out as a person of interest. But Chris doesn't talk like someone who's still under investigation. He talks like someone who's been given a pass. In multiple interviews, he's said things like, "We've been vetted by the FBI," or "Law enforcement knows we had nothing to do with this," or "They've already looked at us and moved on." He speaks with the confidence of someone who believes or wants you to believe that he's no longer a suspect. But that's not what investigators are saying. In fact, they're saying the opposite. They're saying the investigation is active, ongoing, and that no one has been eliminated. So why the disconnect? Why is Chris claiming he's been cleared when law enforcement hasn't cleared him? There are two possibilities. Either he's genuinely confused about what cleared means, or he's engaging in a deliberate strategy to preempt suspicion. And given everything else we know about his behavior, the control, the precision, the narrative management, the second option seems a lot more likely. He's trying to get out in front of the scrutiny. He's trying to shape public perception so that people stop looking at him and start looking elsewhere. But investigators aren't buying it, and neither should you. Here's what law enforcement likely knows but can't say publicly. They know the forensic evidence doesn't support the runaway theory. They know there are no footprints, no scent trail, no camera footage, no sightings. They know the K9 units alerted inside the home, not outside. They know the timeline provided by Chris and Katie has inconsistencies, contradictions, and gaps. They know about the CPS allegations, the history of harsh discipline, the step-parent risk factors. They know Katie's language contains slips that suggest foreknowledge of events she claims not to understand. And they know Chris's behavior fits the profile of someone managing a narrative rather than searching for a missing child. But knowing all of that and proving it in court are two very different things, especially when you don't have a body. Building a case without a body is one of the hardest challenges in criminal prosecution. It's not impossible, it's been done before, and it's been done successfully, but it requires an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence. You need a clear timeline. You need motive. You need opportunity. You need behavioral evidence that points to guilt. You need inconsistencies in the suspect's statements. You need forensic evidence that contradicts their story. And ideally, you need a confession or some kind of admission that ties it all together. In the Sebastian Rogers case, investigators are likely building exactly that kind of case. They're documenting every statement Chris and Katie make. They're analyzing the language, the body language, the contradictions. They're comparing their timeline to the physical evidence. They're interviewing neighbors, friends, teachers, anyone who might have insight into what was happening in that household. They're pulling phone records, text messages, social media activity. They're looking for digital footprints, financial transactions, anything that might reveal what really happened the night Sebastian disappeared. And they're doing all of this quietly, because the moment they announce they're focusing on Chris or Katie, the moment they publicly name them as suspects, the dynamic changes. Lawyers get involved. Communication shuts down. The suspects stop talking. And in a case like this, where the suspects are still giving interviews, still making public statements, still providing investigators with material to analyze, you don't want that to stop. You want them to keep talking, because every time they talk, they give you something. A slip, a contradiction, a piece of the puzzle that doesn't fit. This strategy has worked in other high-profile cases. Think about the Chris Watts case. Investigators knew almost immediately that his story didn't add up. They knew his wife and daughters hadn't just disappeared. They knew he was involved. But they didn't arrest him right away. They let him do interviews. They let him plead for their safe return on national television. They let him talk. And the more he talked, the more he revealed. His body language was off. His statements were inconsistent. His emotion felt performative. And eventually, the pressure became too much, and he confessed. Or think about the Susan Smith case. She claimed a black man had carjacked her and taken her 2 young sons. She did tearful press conferences, begging for their return. But investigators noticed inconsistencies in her story. They noticed her behavior didn't match that of a genuinely distraught mother. They applied pressure, kept questioning her, and eventually she broke down and admitted she had drowned her own children. In both of those cases, behavioral analysis was key. It wasn't the only evidence, but it was a critical piece of the puzzle. It helped investigators identify who to focus on, what questions to ask, and where to apply pressure. And it's likely playing the same role in the Sebastian Rogers case. Law enforcement is watching Chris and Katie closely. They're analyzing every word, every gesture, every inconsistency. They're building a behavioral profile that will support the physical evidence. And when the time is right, when they have enough to make an arrest that will stick, they'll move. But until then, they're staying quiet. They're letting Chris and Katie keep talking. They're letting the public see the contradictions, the slips, the red flags, because the more people pay attention, the more pressure builds. And pressure has a way of cracking even the most carefully constructed narratives. Here's what you need to understand. Silence from law enforcement doesn't mean inaction. It means strategy. It means they're working the case methodically, carefully, thoroughly. They're not going to rush to judgment. They're not going to make an arrest they can't back up in court. They're going to take their time, build their case, and when they're ready, they're going to move with confidence. And in the meantime, they're watching, they're listening, and they're waiting for Chris and Katie Proudfoot to make a mistake, because in cases like this, the truth always comes out. It might take weeks, it might take months, it might even take years, but it comes out. The lies become too heavy to carry. The contradictions become too obvious to ignore. The pressure becomes too much to withstand. Law enforcement isn't saying Chris and Katie are guilty, but they're also not saying they're innocent. And that silence, that's the loudest statement of all. Because if investigators truly believed Sebastian had run away, if they truly believed this was a case of a missing child who left on his own, they would have said so. They would have focused their efforts on search and recovery, on finding a boy who wandered off and got lost. But they're not doing that. They're treating this like a criminal investigation. They're treating the home as a potential crime scene. They're treating Chris and Katie as people who need to be investigated, not eliminated. And until law enforcement says otherwise, until they publicly clear the Proudfoots and shift their focus elsewhere, we have to assume they're still looking inward, still asking the hard questions, still building a case, because the evidence or the lack of it points in one direction, not out into the woods, not down the street, but back to the house, back to the people who were there that night, back to the truth that someone doesn't want told. So, if Sebastian didn't run away, and the evidence overwhelmingly suggests he didn't, then what happened? What's the alternative explanation? What theory actually fits the facts, the behavior, the forensic evidence, and the glaring contradictions in Chris and Katie's story? Here's the theory that investigators are likely working from, the theory that makes sense when you put all the pieces together. An internal event occurred inside the Proudfoot home on the night of February 25, 2024. Chris Proudfoot was directly involved in that event, and Katie Proudfoot, upon discovering what happened, adopted the narrative Chris constructed to cover it up. This isn't wild speculation. This is a theory built on behavioral analysis, forensic evidence, and patterns seen in similar domestic cases. It's a theory that explains the contradictions, the slips, the missing evidence, and the dual narrative model we've been talking about. And while we can't say with absolute certainty that this is what happened because we weren't there, because there's no confession, because Sebastian's body hasn't been found, we can say that this theory fits the available evidence better than any other explanation. So let's walk through it. Carefully, hypothetically, but logically. It's the night of February 25th. Sebastian is home. Katie is home. Chris is home. According to their story, it's a normal night. Calm. No conflict. No tension. But let's consider the possibility that it wasn't as calm as they claim. Let's consider the possibility that something happened, an argument, a disciplinary incident, a moment of escalation. Maybe Sebastian did something that upset Chris. Maybe he talked back, refused to follow an instruction, had a meltdown. Kids with autism can struggle with emotional regulation, especially when they're stressed or overwhelmed. And if Chris had a history of harsh discipline, if he had a pattern of using physical punishment, if he had a temper that flared when things didn't go his way, then it's not hard to imagine a situation spiraling out of control. Let's say Chris disciplined Sebastian. Maybe it started as a reprimand, a punishment, something Chris thought was justified, but maybe it went too far. Maybe Chris used more force than he intended. Maybe Sebastian resisted, and that resistance escalated the situation. Maybe there was a physical altercation, a shove, a strike, a moment where Chris lost control. And maybe, in that moment, something went horribly wrong. This is speculative, yes, but it's not baseless. We know there were CPS allegations involving Chris and Sebastian. We know there were reports of Chris using a belt. We know there was a history of conflict in the household. We know Chris had a temper, a need for control, a pattern of behavior that raised red flags. So the idea that a disciplinary incident could escalate into something tragic, that's not far-fetched. That's a scenario that plays out in homes across the country more often than we'd like to admit. Now, let's say something happened to Sebastian during this incident. Maybe he was injured. Maybe he was unconscious. Maybe, in the worst-case scenario, he didn't survive. Chris would have been faced with a choice: call for help and face the consequences, or cover it up and hope no one finds out. And if Chris is the kind of person who prioritizes self-preservation over accountability, and his behavior suggests he is, then the second option becomes a lot more appealing. So Chris handles the aftermath. He moves Sebastian's body. He cleans up any evidence of what happened. He constructs a timeline that shifts the focus away from the house, away from the family, away from him. He decides that the story will be simple. Sebastian ran away. He walked out on his own. No one saw him leave. No one heard him leave. He just left. It's a story that's hard to disprove, especially if there's no body, no witnesses, no physical evidence pointing to foul play. But Chris can't sell this story alone. He needs Katie, because Katie was the last person to see Sebastian alive, or at least that's what the public needs to believe. So Chris brings Katie into the narrative. Maybe he tells her what happened. Maybe he tells her it was an accident, that he didn't mean for things to go that far, that they need to protect the family, protect themselves, Or maybe he doesn't tell her the full truth. Maybe he just gives her the script. Sebastian ran away. It was a normal night. There was no conflict. Stick to the story. And Katie, whether out of fear, dependency, loyalty, or denial, goes along with it. She adopts Chris's narrative. She repeats the lines he gives her. She avoids the questions he tells her to avoid. She defers to him in interviews, looks to him for guidance, corrects herself when she starts to veer off script. She becomes the secondary narrator, the person tasked with making the story believable, with providing the emotional facade that disarms suspicion. But because Katie didn't create the story, because she's working from instruction rather than memory, she makes mistakes. She slips. She uses past tense when talking about Sebastian. She presupposes actions the evidence doesn't support. She corrects herself in ways that reveal she's trying to stay aligned with a predetermined narrative. She can't maintain the story perfectly because it's not her story, it's Chris's, and the cracks show. Now, let's talk about motive. Why would Chris do this? Why would he harm Sebastian? And why would he go to such lengths to cover it up? The motive, in cases like this, is often simpler than people think. It's not about premeditation or malice. It's about control. It's about a moment of anger, a loss of temper, a situation that escalated beyond what was intended. Chris had a history of harsh discipline. He had a need to assert authority in the household. He had a stepson who, because of his autism, may have been more challenging to manage, more resistant to control. And if Chris saw Sebastian as a problem, as a source of frustration, as someone who didn't respect his authority, then it's not hard to see how a disciplinary incident could turn deadly. The motive isn't to kill. The motive is to punish, to control, to assert dominance. But when that goes too far, when the punishment becomes fatal, the new motive becomes self-preservation, and that's when the cover-up begins. Opportunity? Chris had it. He was in the house that night. He had access to Sebastian. He had the time, those 3 hours he claims he was on the phone to handle the aftermath, to move the body, to construct the narrative. And he had the ability to manipulate Katie, to bring her into the story, to ensure she wouldn't contradict him. Behavioral fit? Absolutely. Chris's behavior, his dominance, his control, his hyper-precision, his distancing language, his self-clearing attempts all align with someone who's managing a crisis, not someone who's searching for a missing child. His need to control the narrative, to shut down alternative theories, to assert that he's been cleared by law enforcement, all of that points to someone who's protecting himself, not someone who's desperate to find Sebastian. And Katie's behavior, her slips, her avoidance, her dependence on Chris, her inability to maintain the story consistently, all align with someone who's covering for someone else, not someone who's recounting genuine events. Now, let's be clear about what we don't know. We don't know exactly what happened inside that house. We don't know the precise sequence of events. We don't know where Sebastian's body is, if he's deceased. We don't know whether Katie was a willing participant in the cover-up or a coerced one. We don't know whether Chris acted alone or whether someone else was involved. There are gaps in the story, pieces of the puzzle we don't have access to, and until law enforcement makes an arrest, until there's a trial, until the full evidence is presented in court, we can't say with absolute certainty what happened. But here's what we do know. We know Sebastian didn't run away. We know the physical evidence contradicts that theory completely. We know Chris and Katie's story has inconsistencies, contradictions, and behavioral red flags. We know Chris has a history of alleged harsh discipline and a risk profile that aligns with step-parent-involved harm. We know Katie's language contains slips that suggest foreknowledge of events she claims not to understand. We know the forensic dogs alerted inside the home, not outside. We know law enforcement hasn't cleared anyone and is treating this as a criminal investigation. And when you put all of that together, when you follow the evidence instead of the narrative, when you look at behavior instead of words, the theory that emerges is this: something happened inside that house. Chris was involved. Katie is covering for him. And Sebastian Rogers, a 5-year-old boy who deserved to be protected, to be safe, to grow up and live his life, is gone. This theory doesn't rely on speculation. It relies on patterns, on forensic analysis, on behavioral science, on the same investigative principles that have solved countless cases before this one. It's a theory that fits the facts. And until someone presents a better theory, one that actually explains the evidence instead of ignoring it, This is the theory that makes the most sense. Sebastian didn't walk out that door, but someone knows what really happened, and the more Chris and Katie talk, the more they reveal, the closer we get to the truth. It's been months since Sebastian Rogers disappeared, and the question that haunts everyone who's followed this case is the simplest and most painful one. Where is he? The search efforts have been exhaustive. In the days and weeks following Sebastian's disappearance, hundreds of volunteers combed through the woods, fields, and neighborhoods surrounding the Proudfoot home. Law enforcement deployed K-9 units, helicopters with thermal imaging, drones, and specialized search and rescue teams. They checked abandoned buildings, drainage systems, bodies of water, and remote areas where a confused or frightened teenager might have ended up. They followed up on tips, investigated reported sightings, and pursued every lead that came in. But despite all of that effort, despite the thousands of hours logged by searchers, despite the community's unwavering commitment to finding him, Sebastian has not been found. As time has passed, the large-scale search operations have scaled back. That's not because law enforcement has given up, it's because the focus has shifted. When the physical evidence doesn't support the theory that someone walked away from a location, when the forensic analysis points inward rather than outward, the search becomes less about covering ground and more about building a case. Investigators are still working. They're still following leads. They're still analyzing evidence, but they're doing it quietly, methodically, strategically, because they're no longer just searching for a missing boy. They're searching for answers. And those answers, they believe, are locked inside the Proudfoot home. There have been no major public developments in recent months. No arrests, no announcements, no breakthroughs that law enforcement has been willing to share. And that silence is frustrating for everyone who wants justice for Sebastian. But it's also strategic. In cases like this, where the evidence is circumstantial, where there's no body, where the suspects are still talking, investigators don't rush. They wait, they watch, they build, and when they're ready, they move. The emotional toll on the community has been immense. Hendersonville is a small town, the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where kids ride bikes down quiet streets, where families feel safe. Sebastian's disappearance shattered that sense of security. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable reality that danger doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from inside the home. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect a child are the ones who fail them. The community rallied around Sebastian in the beginning. They showed up to search. They shared his photo. They held vigils and prayer services. They wanted to believe he'd be found safe, that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding. But as the weeks turned into months, as the evidence continued to point away from a runaway scenario, the hope began to shift. People started asking harder questions. They started looking more critically at Chris and Katie. They started wondering if the family they'd been supporting, the family they'd been praying for, was the same family that knew what really happened to Sebastian. And that's a painful realization, because it means accepting that a child who should have been safe wasn't. It means accepting that the adults who were supposed to care for him may have been the ones who harmed him. It means accepting that Sebastian may never come home. But even in the face of that pain, the community hasn't given up on Sebastian. His name is still spoken, his face is still shared, his story is still told, because people understand that even if Sebastian can't be brought home alive, he still deserves justice. He still deserves for the truth to come out. He still deserves for the people responsible to be held accountable. Justice for Sebastian isn't just about punishing whoever harmed him. It's about honoring his life, his memory, his right to be protected. It's about sending a message that children matter, that their safety matters, that the adults in their lives will be held to account when they fail in their most basic responsibility. It's about making sure that what happened to Sebastian, whatever that was, doesn't get swept under the rug, doesn't get forgotten, doesn't get buried along with the truth. Sebastian Rogers was a real person. He had a life, a personality, interests, struggles, dreams. He wasn't just a case number or a headline. He was a 5-year-old boy who loved technology, who relied on routine, who needed the adults around him to keep him safe. And they didn't. Whether through negligence, abuse, or something worse, the people who were supposed to protect Sebastian failed him. And now he's gone. But his story isn't over, because as long as people are paying attention, as long as investigators are building their case, As long as the pressure continues to mount on Chris and Katie Proudfoot, there's still a chance for the truth to come out. There's still a chance for justice. There's still a chance for Sebastian to be found, for his family to have answers, for the community to have closure. Where is Sebastian now? We don't know. Not yet. But the evidence suggests he never left that house. The behavior suggests someone knows exactly what happened to him, and the investigation suggests that law enforcement is getting closer to proving it. Sebastian deserves better than the story Chris and Katie are telling. He deserves the truth, and one way or another, the truth is coming. Let's bring it all back to where we started. I don't know why he walked out that door. That's what Katie Proudfoot said about her son, Sebastian Rogers. But here's the problem. The door was locked. There were no footprints, no scent trail, no missing shoes, no camera footage, no sightings, no evidence whatsoever that Sebastian walked out of that house. So how could Katie know something that left no trace? That question is at the heart of this entire case. Because if Sebastian didn't leave on his own, and every piece of forensic evidence says he didn't, then someone is lying. And when you examine the behavior, the language, the contradictions, and the patterns, it becomes clear who that someone is, or more accurately, who those someones are. Chris Proudfoot constructed a narrative. He built a timeline with hyper-precision, asserted control over every interview, used distancing language to separate himself emotionally from Sebastian and Katie, and claimed he'd been cleared by law enforcement when he hadn't. He doesn't act like a desperate stepfather searching for a missing child. He acts like a man managing a crisis, protecting himself, and ensuring the story stays on track. Katie Proudfoot adopted that narrative. She repeated the lines, provided the emotional facade, and tried to make the story believable. But she slipped. She used past tense. She presupposed actions the evidence doesn't support. She corrected herself to stay aligned with Chris's version. She avoided questions about punishment, conflict, and CPS involvement. She deferred to Chris at every turn, looking to him for guidance, pausing when he reacted, falling silent when he took over. She's not recounting events she witnessed. She's repeating a script she was given. Together, they created a dual narrative model. One person constructs the logic, the other provides the emotion. It's a pattern seen in domestic cases where one partner harms a child and the other partner covers for them. And it's a pattern that investigators recognize, analyze, and use to build a case. The forensic evidence tells us Sebastian didn't run away. The behavioral evidence tells us Chris and Katie know more than they're saying. The timeline tells us there are gaps, contradictions, and impossibilities that can't be explained by their story. And the silence from law enforcement tells us they're still investigating, still building, still watching. This case isn't over, not by a long shot. And it won't be over until the truth comes out, until someone is held accountable, until Sebastian gets the justice he deserves. Because here's what we can't forget. Sebastian Rogers was a child, a 5-year-old boy with autism who relied on the adults in his life to keep him safe. He trusted them, he depended on them, and they failed him. Whether through abuse, negligence, or something even worse, the people who were supposed to protect Sebastian didn't, and now he's gone. But his story matters, his life matters, and the truth, whatever it is, matters. We can't let this case fade into the background. We can't let the narrative Chris and Katie constructed become the accepted version of events. We can't let Sebastian be forgotten. We need accountability. We need transparency. We need continued pressure on law enforcement to pursue this case to its conclusion, to follow the evidence wherever it leads, to hold the responsible parties accountable. And we need the public to stay engaged, to keep asking questions, to keep demanding answers. Because cases like this don't get solved by silence. They get solved by attention, by scrutiny, by people refusing to accept a story that doesn't match the facts. They get solved when the pressure becomes too much, when the lies become too heavy to carry, when the truth finally breaks through. Sebastian Rogers deserves answers. He deserves for the world to know what really happened to him. He deserves for the people responsible to face consequences. He deserves justice, and we owe it to him and to every child who's been failed by the adults in their lives to keep fighting for that justice until it's delivered. So, don't let this story end here. Share it. Talk about it. Keep Sebastian's name alive. Keep the pressure on, because the truth is out there. And the closer we get to it, the harder it becomes for the people hiding it to keep up the act. Sebastian didn't walk out that door, but someone knows what really happened, and it's time for them to tell the truth. Thanks for watching. If this case moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe. We're not stopping until cases like this get the attention they deserve.